Between 2005 and 2014, I lived and worked in a city whose very name conjures up images of 1930s gangsters, foggy streets with rickshaws and cabs and glamorous nightclubs. Shanghai. Nicknamed in its heyday the Whore of the Orient, it was a place that I discovered was still full of old streets full of 19th and early 20th century houses, giant banks and government buildings of yesteryear, and still dripping with a mysterious East meets West vibe. One man who was intimately associated with foreign Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s was an English soldier and police officer named William Fairbairn, whose nickname was Dangerous Dan, the creator of the SWAT Team idea in law enforcement. The bulletproof vest, a new system of unarmed combat that he liked to call gutter fighting, not to mention a commando fighting knife that still carries his name. Fairbairn revolutionized urban policing on the mean streets of pre-war Shanghai, and some of the hardware he adapted for police use still exists today, in particular modified pistols, really revolutionary for the time. Shanghai wasn't, in fact, one city prior to World War II, but a city of three distinct parts. Since the British had been granted a trading concession in Shanghai in 1842, after the First Opium War, a host of other nations had likewise gained for themselves specially legally separated enclaves in the center of Shanghai, including the United States and Japan. In 1863, these enclaves were merged into something called the International Settlement, governed not by one nation, but by the Shanghai Municipal Council, which was dominated by British and US business interests. Already in 1854, the British had created a colonial-style police force for the settlement that became the Shanghai Municipal Police, a mixture of Europeans, Japanese, Indian Sikhs, and Chinese officers. The second part of Shanghai was also foreign-owned, the French Concession, ruled directly as a French colony from Indochina. Here, the French also created a police force, staffed by French and Chinese officers, plus police officers from nearby French Indochina. The third part of Shanghai was the Chinese municipality, all those areas of the city not legally governed by foreigners. Due to the unsettled nature of China following the fall of the last imperial dynasty in 1912, the Chinese municipality found itself sometimes under central government control, but often controlled by various regional warlords with their own armies and police forces. Shanghai's international settlement and French concession became havens for gangsters, drug peddlers, gun runners, armed robbers, kidnappers, mercenaries, and freebooters of every description and nationality, and also witness to espionage and assassinations carried out between the Japanese and Chinese, as conflict flared in the 30s between those two nations, and the Shanghai Municipal Police struggled to effectively police Sin City. William Fairbairn, a former Royal Marine, had joined the Shanghai Municipal Police, the SMP, in 1907, walking the beat in some of the most dangerous areas of the international settlement, and continually having to engage in physical fights, knife fights, or even gun battles with local hoodlums and ruffians. Just after World War I, Sergeant Major Fairbairn was asked, due to his skills in hand-to-hand combat, knife fighting and pistol shooting, to integrate his skills with the police more widely. He had spent 12.5 years carefully analyzing gunfights. He had been involved in some 200 gunfights himself, and he looked at about 2,000 from the records. The statistics were frightening. In those 2,000 gunfights, police had killed 260 criminals and wounded 193, but the police had lost 43 officers killed and another 100 wounded. Fairbairn was given the opportunity to purchase new weapons, to rearm the police, and also to completely retrain the police in the use of those weapons, for the very unique conditions officers faced on the streets of Shanghai. Fairbairn decided that the police would standardize from a miscellany of pistols and revolvers of many types and calibers onto just 3 weapons. The force consisted primarily, excluding the Japanese section from the discussion as they largely did their own thing within the Japanese concession, of 3 races of police officer. The Caucasians, that is, the European and American officers, the Chinese, and Indian Sikh officers. Fairbairn decided that each race would use a different firearm. The Europeans would be issued with a Colt 1911 .45 caliber pistol. Experiments with Chinese officers, generally smaller in stature than their Caucasian colleagues, showed that they found the 1911 too large and unwieldy. Therefore, Fairbairn decided on the smaller frame Colt 1908 hammerless in .380 ACP. Finally, because the Sikh policemen were mostly recruited directly from the British Indian Army, Fairbairn issued them with the big Webley Mark VI .455 World War I service revolver that they were already very familiar with from their army service. The Sikh officers were also very big men, deliberately recruited for their imposing presences on the streets of Shanghai. Fairbairn's primary consideration was to increase his officers' lethality and give them a better chance of surviving encounters with criminals, almost all of whom were armed in Shanghai. China was completely awash with fearsome weapons left over from World War I, one of the most famous, of course, being the Mauser C96 pistol and its locally made copies. Thousands of these were in the hands of criminals and bandits all over China. Fairbairn emphasized that officers should shoot first and ask questions later. The few seconds between unholstering the sidearm and bringing the weapon into action was often the difference between life and death in Shanghai. Here is one such Fairbairn-approved pistol, one of 4,185 Colt 1911s and 1908s that were imported from the US via Colt's Shanghai representative Eric Sykes, who was a close friend of Fairbairn. This particular pistol was made in 1930, and on the right of the frame is engraved Shanghai Municipal Police and its own property mark, in this case number 1361. This number also appears on the slide and the barrel. If we turn it over, we see a strange-looking hole in the side of the slide. This originally held a spring to enhance reliability of the weapon. This was an idea of Fairbairn's. A shaped leaf spring was used to put pressure on the barrel during recoil to prevent jamming. Jamming, of course, being fatal on the streets of Shanghai. Next, you'll notice the safety is blocked with a screw. This was because, in the heat of the moment, officers often forgot to flick off the safety during gunfights, getting themselves killed in the process. Fairbairn trained the European and Chinese officers to carry their pistols loaded but with the chamber empty. They learned a very quick cocking action as they drew the weapon, and both the 1911 and the 1908 retained their additional grip safeties. Additionally, on this particular example, the original dark grips have been replaced later by non-standard metal ones. I presume this was long after the gun served in Shanghai. Fairbairn had lanyard lugs welded to both types of pistols so that the officers couldn't have their weapons easily stolen from their holsters, or if they dropped them, they were able to recover them quickly. Finally, the magazines were altered. Corruption among some officers saw them selling off ammunition on the black market to criminals. It was a nice little side racket before Fairbairn took control. So Fairbairn tackled this problem by having not only a line of holes drilled in the front of the magazine to show that complete rounds were in fact loaded, but also a series of holes at the rear of the magazine to show the live primers of the cartridges, to prevent officers from loading half the magazine with empty casings. Ammunition was very tightly regulated in the SMP. Magazines were inspected on being issued and on being returned to the armory after each shift to ensure that shots fired were reported correctly and, of course, to combat theft of ammunition. Each officer was issued with 2 full magazines for his 1911 or 1908 on commencing his shift. Fairbairn trained his officers for gunfights, usually of 5 yards range or less, often inside buildings or in crowded streets, firing 2 rounds each time. Additional drills were taught to engage targets while the officer was moving. Officers also learned hip shooting, as the targets might be extremely close, two-handed shooting, which was rare for the period, and the use of cover when shooting, all pretty revolutionary stuff at the time.
In combat firing, a 2-shot burst gives a dispersion of 6 to 8 inches on the target, assuring at least 1 hit. When a moment's delay may cost a life, combat firing trains men to fire instinctively from the standing position, pointing the gun as if it were a finger. To change the direction of fire quickly while at a standstill, just pivot on either foot. When moving forward, it may become necessary to change direction and fire from a walk if the target suddenly appears on the flank. This is combat firing, quick, automatic, and accurate.
Over the border in the French concession, the French colonial police faced many of the problems faced by their colleagues in the SMP, but they did not have a William Fairbairn. Here is the French police pistol used in Shanghai, the Browning 1922. It has a fully functioning safety catch and is marked on the grip frame GM and also the base of the magazine. This stands for Gendarmerie Mobile, the French colonial police used in its various concessions. After 1943, when the French concession was returned to Chinese control, these pistols received new markings for the Shanghai Public Security Bureau. This is noted by 2 characters that say Hugong, followed by their own arsenal weapon number. For the Shanghai Municipal Police, all of this came to an abrupt end in December 1941, when Japanese forces invaded and occupied the international settlement, and though the police continued to function under Japanese auspices into 1942, most of the European police officers were later imprisoned by the Japanese. William Fairbairn was not among them. He had actually retired from the police in 1940 and returned to England with his friend Eric Sykes. Back in Britain, Fairbairn and Sykes were commissioned as second lieutenants in the British Army, charged with training British and Dutch commandos, US Rangers, and also, later, personnel of the American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the American equivalent to the British SOE. They learned his particular ungentlemanly warfare skills, as he famously said, quote, "Get tough, get down in the gutter, win at all costs. I teach what is called gutter fighting. There's no fair play, no rule except one, kill or be killed." End quote.
Here's the simplest defense of all, a quick blow with the edge of the hand across the wrist, possibly breaking it. Another disarm from the front. Seize the wrist in one hand, and with the other twist the pistol against your opponent's fingers. In some cases, this maneuver works better. Grab the gun in one hand, strike the wrist sharply with the other, at the same time pulling the weapon free. A very simple and effective means of reducing the homicide rate when revolvers are used. Merely clutch the cylinder and hold it securely. As long as the cylinder can't turn, the gun can't fire. This is not a good idea if the gun is cocked or of the single-action variety.
Fairbairn and Sykes famously created the commando fighting knife that carries their name. I recently was able to examine one of the very first examples ever made of this iconic weapon at the Combined Military Services Museum at Malden in Essex. If you want to see one of the best collections of Special Forces weapons and equipment in existence, head down to this fascinating museum, link in the description box. At war's end, Fairbairn was a lieutenant colonel and was personally awarded with the U.S. Legion of Merit, rank of commander, at the specific request of OSS founder Wild Bill Donovan. William Fairbairn died in 1960 at the age of 75. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.